What the last few weeks have shown us, particularly when it came to a taxi strike, a week-long taxi strike in South Africa, in Cape Town, is that people were largely stranded. Very, very little option for people to get to and from work, school, wherever they need to be. And it showed the importance of the need for options for commuters. Rail has been a part of the Cape Town commuter mix, but for various reasons, a COVID pandemic, the theft of infrastructure, also governance, financial issues within the Department of Transport, Prasa. How are we getting back to where we need to be? Hishaam Emeran is the Group CEO of the Passenger Rail Association of South Africa. Really appreciate that you could book off 20 minutes of your time to talk to us here today. But I want to start with a startling statistic released by Stats SA last week, the Land and Transport Survey, and that in 2013 there were 46 million passenger journeys, Metro Rail passenger journeys in South Africa. In 2023, there were 46 fewer train trips by South Africans. There has been an increase over the last year, but why have we allowed, and I say collectively, why have we as a country, from governance to citizens, why have we allowed rail infrastructure to crumble to such an extent that we're seeing 46 million fewer train trips than a decade ago? Good morning, Hishaam.
Good morning, Lester, and good morning to your listeners. Thank you very much for having us on your show. We really value the opportunity to speak to Cape Townians in terms of the rail recovery project. You are quite correct. We need to get passengers back on the trains. It has been highlighted through the recent taxi strike, as you've mentioned, the need for options in terms of public transport in particular. And we all know the role that rail has played over the years in Cape Town. Cape Town is typically a rail city. It had the lion's share of public transport passenger trips in the past, and that's certainly where we want to get back to, ensuring that rail is the backbone of the public transport system. Now, your question around how we got to this point is a very important one. And yes, if you date back to 2016, even earlier, passenger numbers were a lot higher. In Cape Town, we were having close to 700,000 trips per day. Today we're sitting at just under 50,000 trips per day. So we have dropped significantly. Part of that was due to initially, if you go back 2-3 decades, the underinvestment in rail that has caught up with us, that we've needed to invest, but also through the deterioration of the infrastructure over time. We've seen a steady decline in the rail passenger transport. But as you know, leading up to COVID and the lockdown is when we saw the steep decline. We, in fact, came out of lockdown, Lester, with only being able to operate 4 corridors out of our 40 corridors nationally.
Because we came out of lockdown, it was almost as if someone had put a blanket over Cape Town. And when the blanket was lifted, we saw literally entire train stations, rail infrastructure simply having disappeared because of theft, of vandalism. It simply wasn't there. I know it was a very difficult time for the country during a lockdown, but I don't think anyone could have expected that literal train stations were in fact stolen during that period.
Yeah. Look, the theft and vandalism was certainly unprecedented. It was severe. I think one of the lessons we've learned, besides the issue of security itself in securing your assets, is one of the biggest benefits or advantages of having your trains running at high frequency. It curbs theft and vandalism if your trains are running. When trains are not running and your system is exposed 24 hours a day, as we saw during lockdown, I think then it becomes a recipe for disaster, so to speak. So that was one of the reasons we had to beef up our security, which we have done, and I'll share some of that with you and the listeners in terms of turning things around. We've come out of a very unfortunate period, but certainly now, in the last 2 years, it's about the recovery, rebuild, which is fully underway at Prasa.
I've not had the opportunity to use the what's called as the People's Train, the Blue Train, the new Prasa Blue Train that particularly runs from the CBD all the way down the southern suburbs corridor. But when I have looked at social media, when I've seen reports, when I've seen even tourist comments, absolutely raving about it. It's secure, on time, and largely seen as almost not just a commuter asset, but almost a tourism asset as well for that particular line. Has that been the blueprint of how you want to roll out throughout the city as well?
Firstly, Lester, we want to invite you on the train. Invite you and all Cape Townians that have not been on the new blue train. We are certainly going through a modernization phase at Prasa. This is one of the elements. It's the new trains that we are manufacturing. And I must just hasten to add that these trains we are building in South Africa. These trains are not being imported from overseas. It's being built in a factory in Gauteng, in Nigel, by local teams, young engineers, men and women. We've appointed a team, a consortium, Gibella, to deliver 600 of these new trains for us. We've already got 150. And it's not just the central line, Lester, we're also running it on the northern line. And we intend rolling this out on all of the corridors as we start reopening these corridors around Cape Town.
Let's go to some of our questions from our listeners. And I ultimately want this conversation to be driven by our listener questions. Question here about the Business Express. Hi, Lester. Please inquire if the Business Express, also known as the White Lady, will operate on the Kales River line again. That was quite popular a couple of years ago. It was a train that left Strand through Somerset West into the CBD. It was seen as a business class train so that people could get out of their cars into the train and get essentially an express from the Gordons Bay Strand area all the way to the CBD. That hasn't been happening for years.
Yeah, that was in fact a very successful train that we ran at the time. Across the country we had various versions of the Business Express, and the one in Kales River as well as the one to Strand here in Cape Town. We ran on both lines the Business Express. It's certainly part of our strategy, and with the new trains that we are running, if you look at the features, the comfort that it brings, it is designed to entice us as car users to get onto the train. It's air-conditioned trains, it's got your CCTV on board, it's got the comfort feature, and it's got the ability to operate at higher speeds than what we see today. Not high speed in terms of what you see in intercity travel, but certainly higher speeds that we can operate. The important thing that we want to do, Lester, as part of rolling out our services going forward, is the issue of travel time. We know travel time is important to our commuters. We want to be competitive with other modes of transport in terms of that aspect. And to do that, it's an express, it could be a skip-stop service, or you could have your fast and your slow lines that we are working on to ensure that we deal with the issue of travel time.
After the taxi strike, the continued conversation of the devolution of train and rail services to either provincial or local authority, it keeps on gaining momentum. The city of Cape Town even saying it's considering an intergovernmental dispute with the president's office, saying that they at least want a conversation on the devolution of rail. Of course, it is a infrastructure utility that is operated and run by Prasa, but I'd like you to weigh in on that conversation on what would be in the best interest of a commuter, a locally run capacity or still within a national capacity through Prasa.
Yeah. Lester, I know that's a topical issue here in Cape Town. You're quite right. I see it popping up in the news quite often in terms of the Cape Town media. And it is an issue that will be addressed. I think the important thing there is that even in terms of national rail policy, it's very clear that there's a process to develop a devolution strategy to inform any process going forward. Now, this is a policy matter. And I just wanted to also, I think, so that the listeners are informed in terms of Prasa's role. We are an implementing agent. We are not responsible for the policy development. Our role is ensuring that we can provide a successful rail service within South Africa, within our metros, as well as our long-distance rail services. And therefore, those discussions must happen. But our focus and our immediate focus is on the recovery, the rebuild, to ensure that, as you say, the passengers get the best possible service that can be delivered to them.
We're speaking to Hishaam Emeran. He's the Group CEO of Prasa, the Passenger Rail Association of South Africa. We're talking about rail here in the city of Cape Town. And want people who use the trains, who want to use the trains, have used the trains, but for various reasons have decided, I will still want to use my car. But let's talk about the future of rail, because here's a very important question, and this is a question that also affects me because I live in the northern corridor of the city. Morning, is there a viable route between Malmesbury and Cape Town? And lots of communities that can benefit: Abbotsdale, Kalbaskraal, Vasantekraal, Chatworth, Atlantis. I'm going to add the Parklands, Dunoon, Blauberg area. If we want to see, we're seeing a growing city towards the northern corridor up the west coast. Shouldn't that also be an option if we are going to expand rail services in the city?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Lester, and you're right. The issue of rail expansion is an important one. We've seen in the last 2-3 decades how the city has grown, mushroomed in terms of urbanization and so forth, but you've not seen the rail network expand. The last expansion we had was in 2006 when we expanded the Khayelitsha railway line through to Kresani. It's only about 4 kilometers. So if you look at Prasa's plans, which we work together with the city of Cape Town in terms of integrated planning, there's a future rail network that is planned. We will talk about the Blue Downs rail link. You talk about the possibility of running through to Atlantis, the Blouberg. There's currently an existing railway line running there. And the options are there in future with the demand that will dictate that to run a rail service. Malmesbury, we're currently running a diesel service. It's a very infrequent service at the moment because we're reliant on a diesel locomotive. But over time, the strategy is to run a more high-frequency service on some of these corridors where we've seen rapid growth over the last 2 decades.
Let's go to the phone lines now. Eunice in Wynberg, your question, your comment to Hishaam Emeran?
Yeah, good morning to the listeners and to the CEO. I've copied in the CEO in an email over the last week or so with regards to the issue in Wynberg East, particularly the Prasa land, where we've got the infiltration of thieves and vagrants on Prasa land right next to the mosque in Wynberg, which is a big issue because obviously we've got issues with pertaining to cable theft, etc. And it's been proven that obviously criminals hide out right in this Prasa property. And I've written on numerous occasions to various individuals, etc. This has been an issue since May 2020 during COVID. And I'd like to know what the plan is with regards to the eviction of the area, because it's been an ongoing issue. I've had meetings with Prasa individuals over the last year and a half, but it seems like the process is just going around in circles. So I'd like to view the CEO in terms of this particular issue, because this is not sustainable on this particular area.
Appreciate
and
you.
We've got various other issues in Wynberg pertaining to Prasa property, such as the wetlands in Vine Road and Castletown Road as well.
Appreciate it, Eunice in Wynberg. Let me expand on that. You can answer, Eunice, but I'll just... How connected is the issue of homelessness, of a housing issue? You're currently also dealing with that central line on the relocation of people who, during the COVID lockdown period, essentially settled on that central line. How connected is the issue of homelessness, occupation in Prasa-owned areas?
Yeah. Thank you, Lester, and good morning, Eunice. Thanks for that question. Yes, I'm acutely aware of the email that you have sent me. And I'm sure you've also seen that we've actioned that item in terms of ensuring that the colleagues are engaging you. It's an issue that we have picked up that needs urgent attention within that specific site. But broadly speaking also, Lester, I think you've touched on the issue, and I'll come back to Wynberg, is that there's a societal issue that we are dealing with here in terms of homelessness as well. And that obviously is not just a Prasa responsibility. We've seen obviously the impact of that spilling into our rail reserves, which is obviously a serious concern. We are trying to react as quickly as possible to when these things happen. There's a phenomenon now within Cape Town of these tent cities that are popping up all over in quite a number of places. And it becomes very difficult in terms of managing that on a day-to-day basis to be in all of these locations. But in the case of the Wynberg one, we are aware of that issue at the mosque itself, where we've seen let's call it the settlement there, the issue of the crime that has happened there. And without giving any direct timelines, Eunice, I know that there's been discussions, and there's discussions planned for next week with our regional manager around that specific issue to ensure that this is not something that continues. We have received, and as soon as we've got your concerns raised, we have actioned it to make sure that these matters can be addressed. And I'm hopeful that with the team now, we will get a solution there in terms of addressing your concerns, Eunice.
I appreciate this message from Steph. He says one of the biggest challenges in re-establishing rail is the dominant mode will be to wrest the market share back from taxis who rush to fill the gap. This is going to be potentially fractious and needs to be planned for. I agree with that, because over the last while, and it has died down, thankfully, the targeting of trains and rail infrastructure with vandalism and arson. So far, I understand only one person has been convicted of a train fire, largely believed to be connected to the taxi industry. So if Prasa gets an act together and starts re-establishing rail as the desired mode of transport, you have a taxi industry who may say, hey, those were our customers, we want them back.
Yeah, firstly on that, we have to talk about integrated transport. The taxis play a very important role within the transport system. One needs to acknowledge that. But it's acknowledged that rail is the backbone of your transport system. The role of the other modes becomes very important in terms of how do you complement and feed into the system. As I've mentioned earlier, a couple of years back we were transporting 700,000 passengers per day. Today we are transporting approximately 15, but we are recovering quite speedily in terms of those numbers. So you can see there's a huge number of passengers that we still need to recoup in terms of where we were a number of years back. We have good relations in terms of stakeholder engagement with other operators to ensure that there is this discussions that are happening. But it's important to note that without rail fully functional in the city of Cape Town, you're going to see what you currently on your roads, the congestion that you have. If there's a breakdown in one of the modes that you have got recently, you can see the gridlock and the time it takes to get people back home from the city and so forth.
Well, Hishaam, let's go to a quick voice note.
Good morning, Lester. Please ask your guest the question that why the new trains are always put onto the Central Line and the Simonstown Line, and those lines that normally get damaged and vandalized first by people. Why those trains aren't put onto the Kills River Line, the Kraaifontein Line, the Strand Line. Kills River and Strand, Kraaifontein, Somerset West, all these lines always get the older trains, the most dilapidated trains. Why don't they put some new trains onto these lines? Every time a new train gets launched, it gets put onto the main line, and that track gets damaged all the time, vandalized, burnt out, and such. Please ask your listener that.
I'm not going to disagree there, Hishaam, because there is a train of thought and a comment in amongst many people that the Southern Line, because it goes through the southern suburbs, usually gets the preferential treatment when it comes to Prasa.
I hear the question, and I want to firstly assure the listener and listeners that we are rolling out the blue trains to all of the corridors. In fact, if you look at where our highest demand comes from, it's from your Metro Southeast sector. The Central Line, which is not fully operational yet, is the highest priority corridor in terms of volumes. The issue of the Northern and down to Kuils River, the listener will be happy to know that we are already running the blue train in the off-peak. And the reason why we are not able just to immediately deploy the blue trains, Lester, is we need to go through a testing, a trial period, and get the approvals from the railway safety regulator before we can run these trains, that the infrastructure is safe, your stations are at the right conditions, and you met all the requirements before you deploy these trains. But I want to assure the listeners that the strategy at Prasa is to ensure that all our corridors Where we've got sufficient trains will be operated by the blue trains. Where we continue to operate the yellow and grey trains, we still have got a program where we have completely overhauled these yellow trains to ensure that they are reliable and in a much better condition in terms of operations.
Quick one here. What's the possibility of night trains? We need to build a 24-hour city and people need to get to and where they need to be. I would love a night train. I remember a period during the 2010 World Cup where it was a great month, and of course we spent a lot of attention in all the infrastructure and logistics, but we had trains that ran up till 2 o'clock in the morning, and people, okay, there were more police that were deployed, more eyes, more ears, but the possibility of night modes of transport.
Currently we're running our trains from about 4:30 to approximately 8:30, 9 o'clock the evening. The issue of the night trains, you're right, especially where you've got the, if I call it the demand, the nightlife within your cities, to look at those things. It's part of our strategies going forward. It's not just about commuting in terms of getting to work and back. There's much more other purposes for rail travel, be it tourism, be it recreation, be it for school, for pleasure and so forth. And we've seen on the various corridors the different types of passenger markets that we have got. So certainly going forward, because at the end of the day, we want people on our trains. The demand is there for night services. These are things that the teams will be looking into.
Another voice note there, Mario?
And the CEO of Prasa. I drive every morning over the M5 towards Observatory. And the train storage facility there, I'm not sure the correct term that you use for it, but it's filled with trains every morning. I would expect that it should be actually empty because those trains are being used to transport passengers from one point to another. Perhaps, maybe my understanding is incorrect, but if those trains were used, then the timing of sort of pickup times at each station will not be delayed, and therefore people will find more confidence in the train system and therefore will use it more often. But it's got to happen before people find confidence in the trains again. So why are the trains just sitting there and gathering dust?
Good question, and the listener there is referring to our Pardon Island depot, where you see many of the blue trains that we are maintaining. And it's a good question because this is part of our recovery program. Where we've recovered corridors, we are still running a limited service. We are not running a high-frequency service on many of our corridors. And the main reason behind that is we are still recovering our signalling system. So on many of our corridors, we are still operating the trains through what we call manual authorization, which does not allow us to run high frequency. We are now in the process of recovering the signalling system. We are hoping that by the end of October, we'll have the southern line, the signalling will be recovered. Already the central line, we've got a contractor appointed to do the signalling. So as we proceed through the course of this year, you will see us starting to introduce more trains on each of these corridors. But the listener is correct. I think part of the things as part of the recovery is getting the signalling system up and running and moving towards a much more higher frequency service so that all of the trains, as he said, you will see them out of the depot on the lines in the morning. For now, it's balancing that aspect of the operations.
Yep.